everyone. Welcome to Data Driven Podcast. I'm Elif Tutuk, Global Head of Product at Scale. Today we have a very exciting topic to talk. It's the new strategies for managing enterprise analytics cloud spend. And together with me, I have Mark Stange-Tregear, who is the VP of Data for Babylist. Hi, Mark.
Hi, good to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you. So, as we are all of the data gravity shifting to cloud data platforms, enterprise analytics teams are adapting the shift to consumption-based pricing models.
Mhm.
I think one of the things that we have seen with pandemic, just not only for data, but all of the services moving to cloud. But in our topic, as it is the data-driven podcast, like we will be more focusing on the reasons for and how to help organizations to manage and monitor the data and analytics related cloud consumption.
Mhm.
So I think you have been living and breathing as the head of data for many organizations and now with Babylist. Do you want to briefly talk about, what is FinOps, why it is important, why we are seeing this trend more and more now?
Mhm. Yeah, certainly. So, FinOps goes well beyond the data space. It refers to a pretty general sense of trying to make sure that you're controlling, understanding, monitoring, managing your online expenses. Obviously, the name is a little kind of parallel to DevOps. It's that idea that you're really taking control, that you're not just spending money. And I think, for me at least, where I saw it really start to grow was, people having negative experiences where these super powerful cloud platforms came along and people started using them, and then people started using them a lot. And all of a sudden, these surprise bills arrived on people's doorsteps. And there was an immediate sort of reaction, like, what happened? what just went on there? And for me at least, that's where the journey started. I think that's true for a lot of people. Like, how do we get control? These tools are incredibly powerful. They open up capacity in a way that 10 years ago just wasn't really there. But how do we control it? How do we manage it? How do we stop those kind of runaway expenses? I think at the more sophisticated level, it's a matter of not just cost cutting, but how do we make sure that we're spending money in the right places and in the right ways? So it really becomes a return on investment calculation and process. When you get to data more specifically, I think that some of the principles are very similar. Managing your AWS cost, whether it's for kind of data or whether it's managing production environments, your APIs and production databases, a lot of the principles apply. I do think that within the data world, there's some features which are maybe not exactly unique, but some things are a little bit more nuanced or require a different approach, or at least a more specialized approach. So maybe the one I thought the most about would be managing Snowflake costs. Same could be true for Redshift or BigQuery, depending on what you're on. I happen to be on Snowflake. And how exactly do we monitor, control, and optimize what we're spending with Snowflake? How do we keep an eye on it? How do we rationalize that back into the business and make sure that we're spending what we want to be spending in the right places?
Yeah, that is great. I think one of the things that you have mentioned, like ultimately, it's about making data informed decisions, like we have been chatting about. And I said data driven, and you correct me, it's more about data informed, which I love that. And maybe one of the reason seeing this type of peak in terms of the cloud-based analytics consumption is not only those cloud platforms are very 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 strong and performance scale, but also like now there's also the trend where there's more power users sitting together with the business users. And one of the trends that I've been seeing is this change of ELT to ETL, ETL to ELT, where there's more users doing data transformation to make that data business ready. So there is more hunger for data, and that is also the other reason. And that goes back to your point. Maybe if you can comment more, how you balance it out. Like you don't want to stop people using data. That is ultimately not the goal. But how do you manage that, and what are the some best practices that you can share?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that trend's right, and I think that in part that's because it's become much easier to move very large volumes of data and store it relatively cheaply. I mean, there's multiple different approaches there, but it seems like overall that's been an ongoing thread within the data environment. So, in terms of thinking about where you're spending your time and resources, it doesn't make sense to spend, for most organizations, I would argue at least, it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a ton of time trying to figure out, what little bit of data should we move, what should we store, what are we going to sort of select. It makes a lot more sense just keep all of it, right? Try and appropriately manage it, so you're not violating privacy concerns and whatever, right? Obviously, that's an important thread. And then work with the full set of data and think about how exactly do we go from that to something that we want to use, right? You're sort of pushing the conversation downstream a little bit. You're less likely to end up in situations which happened all the time previously, where it's like, well, we have this question, okay, but that data doesn't exist because we threw it away because we didn't know we needed it. So I do think that that's true. I think it's pushed the use cases more into kind of the modeling closer to what the business actually needs. That's where a lot of the work is happening. The challenge with that, or one of the difficulties with that, is you can end up in a situation where you are getting a lot of more ad hoc workload. You can end up with really sort of splintered kind of pipelines or modeling processes, which can come with in the data space. I mean, if you're dealing with any amount of data, that's going to reprocessing all of those separate models is going to start to rack up those costs. If you've got 500 Tableau workbooks all running large extracts, that's going to rack up your costs. If they're all in active use, if they're all being used within the organization to inform the decisions that you're trying to make or to improve your customer experience in some way, more or less directly, then great, right? That's a very sensible use of time and resources to maintain all of those workbooks and all of those models. If you're using 10% of them and you've got a whole bunch of stuff out there that's just refreshing for the sake of refreshing, and it's just costing you, 6, 7, 8 figures a year to produce this data or produce these models or refresh these workbooks that no one's looking at, or maybe someone's looking at, but they're not actually making effective decisions or driving the business forward on, like, that is not a good use of money. Right. And ideally, when presented with this information, I think most organizations would say, yes, let's not spend that money.
Yeah.
Right. Where it becomes tricky and where the discipline of FinOps comes in, I mean, the principles are fairly straightforward. Like, let's have good financial sort of oversight and, let's make sure that we're spending money where we want to spend money. How to actually do that becomes incredibly complicated. I mean, if you're running, 100,000 Snowflake queries a day, which is small, actually, for a lot of organizations, right? Like, how are you supposed to go in and understand what are we processing? Is it really worth it? And it gets even more complicated. Like, even if you can figure out if someone's technically using it, are they using it effectively? Are they actually using it to drive some kind of positive return? It becomes much more complicated, and you go from this somewhat kind of pure technical problem into a much more complicated problem where you have to try and combine relatively nuanced technical detail about Snowflake costs and optimizations, or exactly how Tableau or Sigma runs queries, and you have to translate that into the business context where, this person's a marketing channel manager. They're responsible for managing X million a year in terms of acquisition costs, and they're using this information to try and drive those decisions. So but it's costing us X to produce the information for them. So are they actually in a position to optimize enough out that it's worth providing the information? And I think for years, the direction was just more data, because the systems were somewhat limiting, right? Whether that was, going way back, whether that's an old like SQL Server machine where literally, you bought the machine and you did the most you could do with that machine, and it was about sort of access time, or if it's Hadoop clusters and you're buying racks of these things, right, and you're putting millions of dollars down to run them, buy them and run them, or if it's in the cloud, you have this limiting factor where there's sort of a set capacity, and the question is, well, what do we do with that capacity? And you've probably got a technical team which is thinking about what that set capacity, they whether rightly or wrongly, they're in control of how that capacity gets used, right? So if that marketing person wants even more data, you've got a team of data engineers often sitting there, often within the technology organization, making the call as to whether or not they get it. With Snowflake, with BigQuery, that's not true at all. I mean, depending on how you're set up, that person can just fire off queries as much as they want, and they get whatever data they get back. And if they spend $50,000 tuning $100 of spend, well, they get to talk about the $100 of spend that they tuned. They just don't mention the $50,000 that they spent. And if someone else isn't watching it, it basically just rolls up at the end of the year into, oh, look how much we spent on Snowflake. That was a lot of money.
Yeah, I think just like kind of like this is how I look at life as well. Like you enable people, and then you kind of close the monitor, like in terms of what benefit and what they are doing, and then you shape that. So one thing that we have been thinking within AtScale as the product, like as the semantic layer sits in between the all analytics consumption of an organization and the cloud data warehouses. Like the AtScale semantic layer platform sees all of the analytics conversations of an organization. So like we have this active metadata. And then with that, as you said, like now you are as the head of VP of data, now you can actually kind of realize, okay, these business users are really rocking, like they are doing data-informed decisions, or like you can actually see the business impact that they are generating. Let's say maybe, there's awesome work that they are doing around the customer churn, and then like again going like by leveraging the active metadata, then we can expose you like, okay, what metrics they have been using, what queries they are running, so that can actually justify the cost of that business unit, but then also they are getting the ROI versus like just seeing that a group of users, they are running queries, they are using these metrics, but they are not generating that type of business value. Maybe that is the conversation. So in those cases, maybe if you can maybe talk about that, like first of all, what you use, like in terms of tooling or the practices or the people skill set, like how do you provide that type of monitoring? And then once you realize something, what's your way of engaging other stakeholders? Or within Babylist, like do you have already an organization that is responsible overall for FinOps?
Yeah, I mean, we do. Babylist is not a huge organization, so for us, it's not actually too complicated yet. But I think the same principles that we're employing can scale, and I've used this at bigger organizations as well. I think there's a couple of key fundamentals that you have to get down if you're actually going to get into a FinOps practice. Number one, and this is probably blindingly obvious, but I'm going to state it anyway, is you have to have sort of executive buy-in to the concept that this is something important that we want to talk about and look at. And it is worth spending some degree, right? And that can mean a number of different things depending on your organizational size, but we're going to spend some time and effort thinking about this, right? I haven't seen that being a major hurdle just because the bills from things like AWS and stuff are so big. And people, I think at this point, there's a natural fear, especially from finance departments, of hold on, so people can just spend as much as they want here and I'm just going to find out later. So usually that part isn't too difficult in my experience. I think once you've got past that, the next stage, and again, this sounds kind of obvious, but I think this is one of the cores that a lot of people haven't really done, is to think about the scope of what you're going to monitor. So a lot of people I've talked to in this space, particularly for data, are focused on Snowflake or BigQuery because it's sort of the biggest and in a lot of ways most flexible. totally. But there are other elements. I mean, one of the that can get much more complicated. So AWS, for example, are you looking at how much you're spending on AWS to process your data, or on Google Cloud, or on Azure, right? Wherever you're doing that processing, if you're running kind of Kubernetes loads or modeling load, like, are you taking that into account? A lot of organizations, the AWS infrastructure is not set up in a way that you can actually get visibility into that. So the answer is sort of by default, no. Like, we kind of know roughly what we're spending on AWS or whatever, but you haven't got good visibility. And then there's other things, like if you are a consumer application, you're probably doing some kind of event pipelining coming off your application layers. Those bills add up, and they're also very fluid, they're very flexible, they're very spiky, right? Like, a developer implements a new, impression viewed event somewhere on your application, and all of a sudden your event volume doubles overnight. Like, the cost per just move it, depending on who you're with, but say you're using your Segment or mParticle or one of the standard tools there, all of a sudden you've got a bunch of you're into a whole different tier of cost there. You're probably getting more ETL costs as well to move the data, because that's done on a by row basis. So the second step is to really think through, well, what are the tools I'm using, and which ones am I going to consider as part of my FinOps practice? I tend to go everything. I'm very clear on what tools I'm using, what resources I'm using, and either we are watching them or we're on a direction where we will be watching them, right? Like, some of the time. And that's kind of the third step, is once you know what tools to monitor, are you in a position to monitor them? And are you in a position to monitor them in a way that you can actually sort of break down the costs in a way that you can connect back to the business? It's often not, right? Like, if you're not doing this pretty deliberately, if you're running, say you've got a Snowflake infrastructure and you're running, 10 large warehouses that are called warehouse 1 through 10, and different people, different workbooks, different tools are just connected to different ones. And then someone comes in and says, okay, well, how much of that is marketing?
Yeah. Right now you don't have the result, but again, just from AtScale perspective, like if you have a semantic layer in between that kind of knows all those conversations, then this is what kind of makes me awesome, like happy about this, like that, and excites me, that possibility to provide that, which we are actually just released a feature in the product to enable that.
Yeah, that's right. And there's definitely tools. Some of the time, and tools like AtScale can really help. I think the tools are starting to be there. Some of it you just do have to go back and restructure, though, right? And you have to think about, well, Snowflake's a great example, because there's multiple approaches to doing this. Like, do I have separate warehouses? Do I actually push into separate accounts? Do I push even into separate organizations? There's multiple different ways that you can carve things up to try and get this visibility. But if you're not thinking about how do I translate my cost back to my business units so that I can try and get that return on investment, or I can understand that cost in a way that makes sense to put into the rest of my business context, you're probably not going to just default into that. You're probably not going to just fall into it. Even if you do for something like your cloud warehouse, can you really do that for all your data tools, including things like your ETL tools? Probably not. Serious effort. And the final thing I always say is, who's responsible for this? And that's actually a really pretty complicated question, right? Like, because in a lot of ways, if you have a sales team that's spending a bunch of money on Snowflake or on reporting, you want to argue that it's the sales team, right? They should be explaining why they're spending that amount of money. On the flip side, most sales organizations wouldn't by default have someone sitting there with the inherent skill set to tune Snowflake processes or dbt models to save money, right? Like, so you get forced into this kind of cross-functional world where you've got sort of business use or even more technical use, which has to be connected back to specialized skill sets to actually then optimize the cost.
Yeah.
What I've found is that if you're not very clear about that, that can really confuse ownership. Like, whose responsibility is it? And the answer at the end of the day is it's probably a joint responsibility, but that's where a lot of even organizations that have got some visibility, because they haven't stitched together that level of responsibility, they haven't done the work to talk to the business teams about what this really means and how it can be managed. Actually, not a lot happens. You get the visibility, but without any true ownership.
Yeah. So like what you're saying, Mark, just make sure that there is executive buying, and which I agree that there is, because now everyone is realizing. But then is it more having a program, FinOps program, that's been driven maybe by the data organization, but then like making sure that you have stakeholders at the business side, because at the end, those stakeholders, like you are kind of giving the news to them, hey, this is how much you are using and hence costing this much. And then it is the business to justify that cost. And you mentioned that there are some challenges on kind of really verifying that justification, which we can double click furthermore on that. But then once, there's an agreement, yep, we can decrease that cost, we should decrease. And then that comes back to your team right now, like to kind of make sure that there's right optimizations that can be done. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the general outline. And I think the way to see how that can be different is, imagine that, for example, you signed $1 million contract with Snowflake for the next year, right? And it's just up to the data team to manage that. And it's like, well, that's where you get into trouble, because the data team really in a position to actually make the fine-grained judgment calls about whether, how to divide up that $1 million, or whether actually that just wasn't a big enough contract in the first place. You really should have signed a $2 million contract, and it's justifiable that you're going to blow through that and go and buy some more. That's very difficult to do if you put it back on a sort of a more traditional, like, tech-centered data team without that connection into the business and the rationalization. I think the other thing that people really struggle with is this. It's an optimization, not a cost-cutting exercise.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Right. So, and a lot of people miss this, right? It's about how do you bring your Snowflake cost down? How do you bring your BigQuery cost down? How do you bring your segment cost down? That isn't necessarily the right thing. If you've actually done, I mean, sure, take out sort of obvious waste, but once you've taken out the obvious waste, getting the next $10,000, if it's going to cost you 6 months of a data engineer, that's a ridiculous use of time and energy. It's better to pay the 10,000 because their salary and lost opportunity costs are so much higher than what you're going to return. And I've actually been in situations where I've encouraged the business team to spend more, because actually, right, and push the bill up. Because when you think of it as an optimization, if the data is really being used, if it's being used effectively, and if you've kind of already tuned the models, and then you get to the point where you're saying, well, okay, but if this is too slow, like if it's not responsive enough, if we've got too long a wait times, imagine a sales team that's having to wait a minute for reports to load that they're meant to be using on calls with their clients. Well, that isn't going to work. So if you've already tuned this thing as much as you possibly can do, and you're still on 1 minute wait times, and the only way to speed that up at this point is to throw more power and more money at the situation, well, it's probably a really good idea to throw more money and more power at the situation, even though that's going to increase your bills. And you got to have that sort of full view and the full sense of return on investment. Otherwise, you actually potentially end up hurting the business trying to penny pinch.
No, yeah, that is. I love hearing optimization. In some of my conversations with customers and head of CDOs, it's usually like, so far we have been thinking about traditional data governance, especially when you think about semantic data. But then now with the age of cloud data analytics, it is not only data governance, but governance of cost and optimization of performance and cost. So like when it comes to that conversation, I always also kind of refer to it as optimizing the performance and cost. And that is where also like again, coming back to, I will be always talking about semantic layer. It
Yeah.
just in terms of like how semantic layer can also help optimize that, because as it knows about the usage, then it can actually understand, okay, these are the most common query patterns,
Yeah.
then let me create an aggregated materialized view back in the data source without extracting, because also that's another downside, but within the data source. And then, let the semantic layer doing the trafficking in terms of, okay, I already know that there's a materialized view. Let me kind of push that query back to that materialized view.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's just like we will see more and more technologies, hopefully helping that optimization as well. That will make your job easier.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yes, I agree. I think, yeah, I definitely experienced that with AtScale on the semantic layer. I mean, for years actually, less at Babylist and more in previous roles, where I used the AtScale product, I was heavily focused less on some of the semantic kind of joins that are done on the fly. Like we actually ended up we had stable enough models. We actually did that as part of our ETL process in a lot of situations. But the smart aggregation, right? Like one of the quickest and easiest ways to rack up a huge amount of cost is to have a BI tool that's pointing at a really granular table where you have repeat use that requires aggregation.
Yeah.
An aggregation. It's one of the quickest and easiest ways to blow your costs up, other than giving a data scientist access to a 4XL warehouse. That's another really quick and easy way to blow your costs. But if you have, again, right, like, and it's good, like sales teams, customer service teams, marketing teams, right, and you give them dashboards or data to help them make the kind of ongoing decisions that they have to make day in, day out. And there's a lot of them, and they're doing this repeatedly. And you're set up in a way that each one of those interactions is pushing queries down to large tables over and over again. I mean, some of the tools out there, like Tableau and like Snowflake are trying to tackle this. They've got caching. They're relatively smart, right? They're trying to hold things in memory or reserve things. But with aggregations, that becomes particularly tricky. Or if you're passing down custom parameters, right? It's tricky to get that right because you can't just cache the results that the previous person looked at. And that's, I think, where, tools that sort of sit in the middle of this and can get more sophisticated about anticipating patterns and sort of be clever about, well, we know there's going to be this repeat pattern that can be served much more efficiently if we just do this one-time run versus pushing this down 150 times in the next 3 hours, right?
Yeah.
It is a huge win. There's a lot of room here. I think one of the other key areas is looking at ETL or DBT kind of patterns and think of, like DBT is great, like building models in a very structured kind of way. But then how often are we seeing end users actually combining kind of MART tables or end tables or going back to raw source tables over and over and over and over again, sort of working effectively around the data products that you're building? And how do you, within all of your Snowflake logs or your BigQuery logs, how do you identify that kind of repeated pattern? Because it's especially if it's coming through SQL and not through a BI tool, because the queries probably look subtly different every time. And then how do you actually anticipate that and translate that into, we should really just build a model there, create that at 7 a.m. in the morning, and we will knock out, this 1,000 custom queries a day that are kind of killing us.
So in those cases, like if you don't have a system that does this automated data engineering based on the usage patterns, like do you have a practice in place where you maybe classify different user groups? Like, okay, this is the set of users, they are power, they are ad hoc. You know that they will be running those types of ad hoc SQLs and it's okay because it's part of the job. They are going after a hypothesis. So like maybe like segmenting users is one way. Like what other methods do you use or
segmenting users. in some ways the most obvious way. So my standard approach to this, particularly with Snowflake, is to have separate warehouses for the different organizations within the department, within the organization rather. So we would have separate sales warehouses to marketing warehouses. You lose a little bit in terms of kind of data caching, but you gain, I would argue, significantly more in terms of ability to optimize. I often have warehouses set aside for the data scientists or the analysts who are more likely to go in and poke around at stuff, but where you can also expect a, more understanding of different sizing and costs, right? So you just sort of pull that out. When the organization gets big enough, you may have, okay, this is my sales data science warehouse.
Yeah.
So you know exactly who you're going after. You can kind of back into it depending on the number of users you've got by looking at the user logs and then mapping the users to departments. But that means that you then have to implement some kind of metadata layer that translates users into departments.
Yeah, which we can help.
Which you can have. It just means that you've got to put that in place, right? So you're going to have to do some work somewhere along the line to be able to actually manage this effectively. But you can choose where to do it in some cases.
So, Mark, I know you have spent a good amount of your you have great experience with the retail sector. So maybe if you could briefly talk about the analytics use cases for your current organization, and also just overall for online retail sector, how does analytics drive business value?
Yeah, I mean, so I think Babylist is a really interesting product for those people listening that don't know. It's an online baby registry. You can go in, and we have our own store, so you can create your registry online, as you maybe would have done in the olden days go into a store and do it on a piece of paper. And you can add things from our store, but we also work just universally. You can add products from anywhere else, and effectively we will consolidate it and link it all nicely for you and make it visible in one sort of easy to access place for anyone who wants to go and get you gifts. We have a very strong consumer focus. We know our audience very, very well. We've been around for a while. We've got also a lot of connections and very strong relationships with vendors in the kind of baby goods space, and there's a lot of vendors in that space, and they can be relatively specialized. So we have these multiple sort of internal facing teams, but we do have the consumer experience. We're a large scale consumer app. We then also have multiple B2B type business relationships, whether that's sort of a vendor supply chain type relationship or more of a media type relationship. And we need data in all of those different places. So the general philosophy that we have about the use of data, you mentioned it, we don't actually talk about data driven, it's data informed.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
The idea being, right, sometimes because we're close to our use cases, we've got a pretty good idea of what's going on with or without data. We always like to bring data to the situation where we can. But it isn't, we don't derive from the data necessarily. But I think we have a lot of the standard use cases that most kind of consumer applications have. We need to understand how our consumers are interacting with our product. It's important to us to try and improve that. And obviously, if we can improve the product, we expect that people will ultimately spend more and use us more and refer us to their friends more. And, it will help our business grow. And in the long run, that takes quite a lot of crunching, right? We're crunching those consumer applications. We have to monitor our sales volumes. We have to monitor our registry volumes. We're running CRM programs. We've got big email and push campaigns. And then on the other side of the business, we supply a lot of information back to our vendors and our partners. helping them understand where the product demand is, helping them help us to make sure that their products are in stock and in the right place and that we've got the right volumes, or that we're putting experiences out there that can help the consumers to find the products. The interesting thing about the baby space is it's a lot of discovery. If it's your first kid, like, you probably don't know the brands, you probably don't know the vendors, you probably don't have a preferred stroller brand or bottle brand or whatever it may be.
As a consumer, you are using actual data to kind of inform and make decision, hence the purchase. And you are using data for your consumers so that they can get the best ultimate experience out of that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that powers a lot of kind of thought about discovery and how do we help people discover from often a very cold start type of position, which is an interesting consumer, it's an interesting consumer position to be in.
That's interesting. So as you're talking about these analytics use cases, which is awesome, like, what is the cost allocation? Like, do you have a central cost? Is it the finance department who is kind of managing the all cloud cost, or do you have any chargeback structures? If you can maybe talk about that some more.
Yeah, so we're evolving the practice out. I would say at this point, so my team manages all of the data-related cloud costs. We're fully aware of what they are. We negotiate we're on the front line of negotiating all the contracts and dealing with all the terms and conditions, and then sort of visualizing back what the usage is and what the usage is. And we're starting to build that kind of practice of allocating the cost back to certain teams, back to certain departments, and we're ramping up those conversations. I would say, we're maturing in this space. We've got a sense of where we're going. It takes a little while to get there, right? Like, it is not inexpensive to reorganize your infrastructure to be able to monitor and to be able to associate the cost back. So I would say we're doing more than chipping away at it. That sounds too slow, but it's a process.
That's a process. Yeah.
And
go ahead, sorry.
For any vendors that are listening, so AtScale, I think, is ahead of the curve on this. For anyone else that may be listening in, this is starting to become a factor as I'm thinking about what tools we're using and procurement. This is becoming a factor in how I think about things, right? Like, can I structure this in a way that I can actually understand where my costs are coming from, that I can explain this, and frankly, in a way that is understandable and usable with my sort of business peers and business stakeholders, not just to the technical side of my team.
That's good. That is actually kind of ties back to my next question. I was going to ask about what are your challenges. I think when we were prepping for this call, we have been talking about, from AtScale perspective, it's all about analytics consumption, providing visibility and helping you with that. But then you have made a good point, like, there's a lot of other services running on the cloud. So maybe if you can talk about, like, what is the future trend, what is the need that you see in the market to kind of help you with some of your challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think just doing this at scale, I don't think there's too many templates in how to do this well, which is interesting. And I think that's probably a sign that this is still an emerging line of thought. I mean, I know there's some groups out there that are starting to talk about this, but I don't see it, especially in the data space, as a well-established kind of area where there's been a lot of thought, or where there is sort of the playbook, like, this is how you do this. If it exists, I certainly haven't seen it, and I try and keep my eye open for these things. So where are the challenges that I'm facing? Well, some are maybe a little specific to Babylist. We're a very rapidly growing company. We're innovative. We're doing a lot of new things, and just that means a lot of potential new data sources. So trying to balance, like, where do we bring data in? Where do we spend time optimizing? Do we double down on kind of, with the engineers, analytics and data engineers I do have, do we double down on tuning existing workload? Do we focus more on doing a good job with new workload coming in right now? Like, how do we balance that? And again, trying to connect that back to the business value so that we're not spending valuable team resources in areas where we're not going to get the appropriate return. I do think that's a more general problem, is there aren't that many people out there that actually really understand this calculation and how to do this, because it is a relatively new discipline. And frankly, you need someone, whether you call it data engineering, analytics engineering, there's other kind of terms out there. You need to find people who can understand the business use case as well as the technical side.
Yeah.
Because if you've just got someone who understands the technical side and is very focused on the technical side of things, it's incredibly easy for them to go down relatively low value paths. And it may be, yes, okay, you tuned that job. It totally wasn't worth the time.
Yeah.
Right. So hiring the right amount of talent and then finding talent who can actually think comprehensively enough to truly do a good job of optimizing and not just sort of fix the technical problem that's an interesting challenge. I'm very fortunate. I work with a very strong team right now, but this is not an easy fit. So that's another kind of key challenge.
I think you made an interesting. I'm seeing this trend, all over the places. Like, it's just, having the right mindset that understand the business and the value, and then tying back to technology. Like, this is, when it comes to also, making, better use of analytics. That's why, the businesses now is approaching more with a hub and spoke approach. Like, there is no only one central data team, but it's all about how they can enable, and also how providers like AtScale can provide solutions to enable the business units with that innovative data product creation, but then without hurting the economic side of things as well.
Well, and I think that that's a really tough balance. I mean, the hub and spoke model, I don't actually subscribe to. We have a central team, data team at Babylist, and I think that that's there's definitely different ways to go. What I found is one of the challenges in the data space, just more generally, is the notion of career paths and development and management. I see a lot of analysts, I hire, so I talk to a lot of people through recruiting process or just kind of peer to peer. And one of the incredibly common themes in the data space, and this is true for data engineers, analytics engineers, but it's much more true for data scientists or analysts, is they get stuck. Right? If you're a sales analyst who's working and you're basically the only sales analyst, you're working on a team with salespeople, you're reporting into a sales manager who knows nothing much about analytics or data more generally, how does your career grow? It can, right? But how are you getting these new skill sets? How are you understanding things like FinOps and how that's supposed to work? Like, it's a real challenge. So my preference, a strong preference, is to actually have a central data organization to focus on kind of the mentoring, the training, and then, have people work very closely in a cross-functional way with the business units, but structure it so that there's a more clear kind of center of excellence type approach.
Yeah, and that is great. Like, I mean, I think if it is working for the organization, then that is awesome. Just overall, as you have said, like, as data roles, or the people who are in the data roles, as they grow in their career, like, they become more business facing anyway. This is the kind of how they can grow, and that is kind of like, and also understanding these new concepts like FinOps, just to kind of help them grow. I think we are getting close to top. Like, just a maybe final thoughts, like, as you go through this journey, like, do you have any final suggestion to the audience if they are starting new to their FinOps journey?
Starting new, I think that goes back to the earlier question you asked as well. I mean, one, probably the first thing is, do you actually understand how much you're spending? Like, again, talking about data FinOps, do you actually understand how much you're spending on your data infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Including what component of your AWS cost or Google Cloud cost is in there. If you don't, then probably the very first thing you need to do is to actually understand that, whether that's going back to whatever degree you can do, and you may not be able to get it precise. Go back to the finance team and take a look at what percentage of your total company cost that is, and just at a very high level, make a decision with kind of the exec team, with the leadership, with finance, whoever the appropriate person is in the organization, like whether this is big enough that it's even worth caring about, because it may not be. You may be small enough and lean enough that it's not a good use of mindshare. Right. If it is big enough, if it's actually getting up there, it's a significant cost for the company, and you decide that you do want to get into FinOps, then there's a couple of key things to do to start with, and then you can figure out the details from there often. One is, who owns this? Right. The way I sometimes put it with my team is, who's getting promoted if it goes well, and who's having a rough review if it goes badly, right? Who is that person? And you need a person who's thinking about this.
That's great. Yep.
Even if you're a team. The second thing is, what are your goals? I've actually seen this. I've talked to people, and I've seen people talking about this, where they're like, yeah, no, we're doing FinOps. And what they're actually doing is they're just watching the data, which is definitely part of it. But when you ask the question, like, well, what's your goal? Like, well, how do you know if you're doing a good job or not if you don't know what your goal is? Basically, you're just watching the information scroll past. So the other thing that is, like, what's your target? Like, if you're currently spending $1 million, is your goal to maintain that? Is it, no, we're comfortable spending more than that if we can prove the value? Is it, no, we need to cut 50% of that spend? Like, what is it? There may be different situation is going to give you different goals, but if you don't establish goals, you're playing at this. You need to know what that is.
That's great. And I think, just Mark, overall, you have mentioned this, like, maybe as part of this is think about optimization. Because when you said, goal, I was thinking, oh, is it cutting back? No. And you have mentioned, like, the goal could be increasing that if you are getting the value. So yeah.
I think the reality is, for most people, it starts with a cutting phase. Because if you haven't spent a lot of time on this, but it's big enough as part of the organization that it's worth spending time on, there's almost certainly probably a good amount of waste in the system. Right. So just generally, if this is becoming an issue for you and you're new to it, you're probably wasting money in there. So it's very natural to start with just cutting out the waste. And you can often do that pretty quickly. At a certain point, you're going to reach where it's like, hold on, is it really worth spending like 3 weeks tuning this one job? And you may be right that it's not. And at that point, then you start to invert a little bit. Now you've got all of the low hanging fruit, and it's really start to think about, well, how do we optimize versus just cutting?
Perfect. Well, Mark, thank you so much. Like, thank you for sharing all your experiences and then, what you have learned during your job journey with FinOps. So we really appreciate, and I hope it was a great session for the audience as well. So thank you for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you.